and set forward peace among all persons through Jesus Christ our Lord. Let us say together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forever. Amen.
Honourable Senators, before we formally commence our proceedings, we have been informed of the passing of two of our former senators, and former Senator Anderson Morrison and former Senator Arnie Walters. I ask you to join me in a moment of silence in honour and respect of the passing of our two former members. May they rest in peace. The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honour.
But we have announcements. We have apologies for absence from Her Honour Senator Thompson, who's unwell, and Senator Most Honourable Ron Walker, who's overseas, as well as Senator the Honourable Chad Blackman. Indications of late arrival from Senator Gregory Nichols, Senator Chris Maynard, and Senator Monique Tate.
Minutes.
Minutes, we have, in relation to our minutes of Wednesday, 15th of January 2025, these are to be deferred. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the deferral of the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, the 15th of January 2025.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, January 15th, 2025 be deferred. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those minutes are accordingly deferred.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers. Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions related to the business or sitting of the Senate are moved by a minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the first reading of the Health Services Amendment Bill 2025 and also the first reading of the Foreign Currency Permits Bill 2025.
The question is that the Health Services Amendment Bill 2025 and the Foreign Currency Permits Bill 2025 be read a first time. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those bills are accordingly read a first time.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Sir, order number 10. In the name of the honorable leader of the Senate, who will move the second reading of the Foreign Currency Permits Bill 2025.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, thank you very much. This is a bill that has come up to this honorable chamber originating in our global business sector. And I think those of us who were in the Senate in 2018 remember a marathon night just on the eve of Christmas where we left this chamber somewhere in the wee hours of the night, very late hours of the night. On that night, we did, I believe there were 13 pieces of legislation. And it was because at the time there were, as we transitioned from one government to another, there were obligations that had been undertaken by the previous minister with responsibility for international business that then had to be very rapidly put into law. And we spent an entire night going through 13 bills. And so for those of us who sometimes are watching the number of bills we do in a day, that was a marathon night on that occasion. And that night came out of, as I mentioned, a previous administration having to implement a series of requirements under the OECD harmful tax practices, specifically the base erosion and profit shifting program. And a series of pieces of legislation needed to be repealed, needed to be replaced, and new regimes needed to come into effect. And on that basis, Mr. President, we saw that there were a number of pieces of legislation, in particular 9 preferential regimes that established what we used to call the offshore business sector, but no longer is called that because it is no longer compliant with the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development and our overall OECD Global Forum obligations. And so all international businesses began to be domesticated as local companies, beginning in 2019, the January of that year, immediately following that marathon session of the Senate in December of 2018. Barbados would have committed under the FHTP, Forum for Harmful Tax Practices, that's what it is, to take a number of actions and to undertake extensive amendments to the overall legislative framework governing that global business sector that I talked about. It was agreed to do a number of things, and these are some of the things that were agreed for the benefit of those that are listening: to remove provisions relating to legislation, including the International Society for Restricted Liability, to repeal the International Business Companies Act. I already pointed out that the notion of an international business company was no longer compliant with OECD rules, to remove the Exempt Insurance Act, CAP 308A, and to remove the International Financial Services Act, CAP 325. Then there were a number of other pieces of legislation that were also removed, and so we had to take a number of actions. I am going to take a moment to just go through what some of those actions were for the benefit of the colleagues. One, we needed to change the wording of our trust legislation. We needed to make changes also under our exchange control legislation. We needed to make some changes under our value-added tax legislation and the Property Transfer Tax Act. During that process, there were 2 main areas that were not included that really ought to have been included, and the action being taken now is to, 1, regularize the sector, as was said in the other place, but also to address 2 segments of the market that qualify to be holders of foreign currency permits, but were not incorporated under the original legislation. So, as I said before, this would have arisen out of 2018 and into 2019. And by definition, a person by law, namely a company, a juridical person in this case, entitled to be called a holder of a foreign currency permit, is a company, this is largely, that earns 100% of their revenue from outside of Barbados. Their earnings are 100% foreign currency and 100% outside of the country. So no local revenue generation at all, 100% outside of the country. Government had a task force. This task force has existed across governments over different times, and so this task force made a number of recommendations as it related to the foreign currency permits legislation. And so, in the first instance, having defined who is a foreign currency permit holder, the trust amendments to the trust legislation excluded trusts by definition, when trusts, as we see in other jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands, like Cayman Islands, trusts really ought to have been incorporated, and you will see the amendment in the legislation to have trusts now listed. It meant then that with the omission of trusts under this legislation, those trusts that were originally set up as international trusts were therefore no longer eligible to be able to have the benefit of exemptions from exchange controls, stamp duty, indirect tax from VAT, and therefore there were some challenges that we experienced in the sector. You remember I started out by defining what an FTF, what the foreign currency permit holder looks like, how they earn their revenue, where their revenue comes from, and then the legislation that had to be amended as a consequence of the OECD actions. It meant, therefore, that you had a number of trusts which were then, therefore, called non-resident trusts. They were not considered resident by their registration, as it was at the time. They did not satisfy any of the requirements, but they earn 100% of their revenue out of Barbados. And so the proposal here, quite simply, is to have trusts now included in the legislation under the Foreign Currency Permits Act. Now, this regime started in 2019, and as a consequence, between 2019 and now, this segment of the market has not been able to benefit from the exemptions. Over this time, they have had the levying of 17.5% tax on trustee services on clients who otherwise have no connection to Barbados. If you're earning 100% of your revenue out of the country, then by definition, a local consumption tax ought not to apply. And so the simple thing here is that we want to make sure that Barbados is competitive, because that's where the second part of my presentation is going to go, with Barbados as a competitive jurisdiction. Secondly, we also had another significant exclusion. The significant exclusion specifically is as it relates to the Customs Act. And in the customs legislation, you have a number of entities, namely manufacturing companies in particular, that have operations in Barbados, but they don't do business, substantial business in Barbados, but they have started to establish offices because under our economic substance legislation, also related to the OECD, there has been a requirement to establish a presence, to have some part of your operations domiciled in Barbados. And so they began the process of procuring office space, buying machinery, setting up equipment, and in many instances, as you are familiar, the Barbados Manufacturers Association, and already under the manufacturing sector, they already qualify if you are a manufacturer and so designated by law, you are already eligible for a duty-free exemption on your inputs because they are then considered re-exports. In this instance, if there were manufacturing entities, they qualified. But if they were not, they were in this no man's land that we are now seeking to correct. And so, in summary, the customs exemption and the inclusion of trust are the two principal elements that were excluded and are now being accounted for because they are covered under the 100% of their foreign currency earnings outside of Barbados. Now, if I were to go to the legislation itself now, the legislation has allowed for a number of changes that I want to draw to the Chamber's attention before I go to the specifics of my presentation on competitiveness. So as it stands, the legislation will make the following changes. In Section 2, the legislation speaks to that definition that I spoke about earlier. What is a qualified person? And the qualified person now reads, qualified person means a company, an external company, a firm, a society, or a trustee in relation to a trust, and I spoke about trust before, where the company, external company, firm, society, or trust, as the case may be, earns 100% of its income in foreign currency. It goes on to include the definition of what is a company, and that is an exclusion that is also not in the original legislation, but is now being corrected in this version of legislation. Shipping companies in particular were also not included. They are now being captured under the legislation, and the definition will now read, a company has a meaning assigned to it by the relevant section, and it includes a shipping corporation within the meaning of the Shipping Corporations Act. When I brought the Business Barbados legislation through this honorable chamber, establishing the company called Business Barbados, we talked about the principles of natural justice, the right to be heard, the right to appeal, making sure that there's transparency in why government does what it does. And my office has also sought to apply that same principle to this legislation. And so there are a number of principles that we have incorporated into the process of applying for a permit. Under the legislation, Section 32G has been amended to include that the official corporate number or registration number assigned to every entity carrying on business under this regime will now be covered as follows. 1, it covers the name, the address, basic information, and so on. And then in the event that your permit, previously existing or new permit, is either canceled or refused in its application, the director shall now give right notice in writing, as well as the reasons for refusing to grant a permit, the reason for canceling it, or the reason for refusing to renew an existing permit. Then the legislation goes on to make a number of additional amendments, equally as it relates to the details of the role of the director. They shall include the reason for the refusal, cancellation, or the non-renewal in their notice going out to the holder of a foreign currency permit. Then, under the surrender of a permit, it also covers a number of things which are also being corrected. Previously, a person could submit, qualified person could submit a permit by filing a declaration with the director. The Act now makes provisions for the circumstances under which these permits can be surrendered. It covers the exemptions that I spoke about earlier under the Exchange Control Act, and it includes now the customs exemption, which was excluded originally, and it now says the following. Under Section 9A, it says machinery, equipment, etc., exempt from certain taxes and duties. And then it specifically outlines what the regime requires. It says a holder of a foreign currency permit may import free of customs duty, consumption tax, ad valorem stamp duty, and other like duties, taxes, and imposts, such plant, machinery, equipment, fixtures, appliances, apparatus, tools, and so on, as necessary for the holder of a foreign currency permit to carry on its business. In the event that you are selling this machinery or equipment required to carry on your business, because the designated time frame is 5 years, if you are selling them within the 5-year period, you either have to sell it to another holder of a foreign currency permit so it doesn't find itself into dutiable spaces in terms of the sectors, or alternately, you have to pay the amount of tax that was foregone. So you have two choices. You either keep it under the foreign currency permit regime, or if you're selling it to any of us in here who are not eligible for foreign currency permits, to the most part, to the best of my knowledge, then you have to pay the government the taxes. Then we go on, Mr. President, into the sections that I wanted to draw your attention to earlier on customs, and that is all captured in the relevant sections of the legislation. But I want then to draw your attention, Mr. President, to the state of the sector. And I think this is perhaps the most important part of the presentation, but I wanted to make sure that I gave the context for why we were making these changes. Mr. President, in 2019, when this regime started, as I said, in January 2019, coming out of the 2018 amendments. And for that very first year, Barbados had 586 new entities applying for a foreign currency permit. That was 2019. By 2020, there were 264 new entrants, 449 renewals, bringing the number to 713 in total. So we went from 586 in 2019 to 713 in 2020. In 2021, we had 1,892 new foreign currency permit holders, 585 renewals, and a total of 2,477 foreign currency permit holders. So a further increase from 713 to 2,477. By 2022, we had an additional 259 new foreign currency permit holders, 2,093 renewed their regime, and then you had a total up again of 2,352 foreign currency permit holders. In 2023, the International Business Unit recorded 288 new foreign currency permits, a total of 2,262 renewals, taking us to 2,550 active foreign currency permit holders. As at the end of last year, 2024, we now find ourselves in a position where 314 new foreign currency permit holders entered the market, 2,151 of the 2,352 of the previous year renewed, and we have now a total of 2,465 foreign currency permit holders. You can see the progression, therefore, Mr. President, from 2019 when the regime began and 2024, where we just finished the financial year, and the expectation is that by 2025, with this amendment, and with the amendments that we have just made as it relates to the customs duty, inclusion of trusts, removing or including the shipping sector, that the expectation from my ministry, Mr. President, is that we will see an increase in the foreign currency permit regime for the year 2025. Now, this is important, Mr. President, in context, and why? Mr. President, last week, I had the opportunity to chair a process that I believe you have led in a previous incarnation when you sat in this chair. The negotiation of your global regime with bilateral partners under bilateral investment treaties and double taxation agreements. We're now on the cusp of opening negotiations with a number of new partners. There are 4 immediate partners that we are on the cusp of negotiating. The negotiating team is preparing to travel next month to open negotiations with Germany. They will be continuing the second round of negotiations with Ghana, which we completed the first round in November and then into December. We will be opening also in March negotiations, Mr. President, with Hong Kong, and we expect that coming out of the work that we have started to do in collaboration with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade and the Invest Barbados team, along with the Barbados Revenue Authority and others, all of the global business community partners, that we will be implementing a new strategic plan for the rollout of the attraction of global business to Barbados. That's one. We've also started the process of looking at the strategic repositioning of Barbados as a global business hub. What are the key things that we consider the mind of business? And we said to the team, we don't want you to consider the administrative part of it on our side only. We know what the regulatory parts of it require of us, but we want you to get into the mind of global business. What is the mischief that we are trying to correct? What makes Barbados more attractive a jurisdiction than another jurisdiction for like business? Because let me be clear, Barbados is not a BVI. They're a different jurisdiction than Barbados. Barbados is not a Cayman, different jurisdiction, different type of global business. Barbados is not a TCI, different jurisdiction, different segment of the market. While it's all global business, there are different segments and different niches that we compete in, and we're not in the same space. Trusts operate oftentimes in a different market, but by making these changes to our foreign currency permits legislation and including trust, it allows Barbados to compete in that space as well, whereas others typically would have held an advantage, a competitive advantage. This is a competitiveness measure, Mr. President. Earlier, and the point that I was starting to make is that last week we had a dedicated meeting where we had our global tax advisor, who was the former tax advisor for the OECD, and he is now advising Barbados, and he came down and he spent the week with us last week, along with the international business team, along with the Global Business Association, BIBA, ICAB, the Barbados Revenue Authority, of course led by the International Business Unit of the Ministry of Energy and Business, and with the private sector partners, so that together, not only are we setting the strategic framework that I spoke about, but we're also preparing for those negotiations that are up and coming over the coming months, Mr. President. And it really is about how do we not just want to talk about the mind of business, get businesses to come to Barbados in the first place to set up domicile, but then most importantly, you know, when you have exciting advertising, Mr. President, you see an ad, and the ad comes on, and you say, for example, it's advertising Burger King, and the burger looks good, and the fries look good, and you think to yourself, maybe I should go through the Burger King drive-thru today, and then you bite into it, and it doesn't taste the way it looks like it did. But just an example to tease my Senate colleague, but Mr. President, you want to make sure that when you market something, that what you have marketed, people feel as though you have delivered. And so on the one hand of this country, we cannot be marketing Barbados as a jurisdiction to do business, inviting companies to come to the country to domicile, and then not delivering on the brand promise that we have set up. And so I have spoken at great length in this chamber and in other places about the importance of business facilitation in this country. I have acknowledged openly in this chamber and in other places that business facilitation in this country sometimes can be a real challenge. I have said on many occasions over time that there were difficulties with the institution that we knew as KIPO, and that I acknowledge that both the business community and the staff at KIPO were challenged by the environment within which they functioned, and that it did not deliver on the brand promise of Barbados as a jurisdiction with which to do business. I'm standing here today, Mr. President, having had the opportunity over the last year to absorb the entity that was KIPO into, over the last few days, on Saturday starting, into the new Business Barbados. Business Barbados that we've talked about for the last year, and Prime Minister announced was created on Saturday. Or rather, I should say the legislation came into effect on Saturday. We took the opportunity on Friday evening to have almost a team building session with all of the staff from KIPO that will be transitioning over into Business Barbados. And we talked about what needed to be in terms of taking fresh guard. Taking fresh guard. Marking a line in the sand, covering it over in cement, and starting fresh. Coming with a new vision. Coming with new operational procedures. Fixing small things that are right in front of you that don't need no real big law thought process to resolve. Right, Mr. President? And we had that last session with the team, and I want to say that I am so privileged to lead a team that is excited, eager to make some of the changes. As we sat in that room with the team, yes, on Friday evening, closing off a new era and committing to starting a new one, the enthusiasm of those officers was overwhelming. Minister, we can make some recommendations, we think we should do this. When we finish this meeting, we have some things that we want to recommend that we can do differently. They too want this change. I'm saying to Barbados that the staff know at the new Business Barbados, they want this change. So Monday morning, I walked into Baobab Towers. And as I walked into Baobab Towers, Mr. President, one of the officers who had been in the meeting on the Friday, she popped out. Are you looking for Business Barbados, miss? And I said, no, I wasn't here to y'all. And then I walked a little further along the corridor, and another one pops up, welcome to Business Barbados. Can I be of assistance? And they were just so excited because there is a new customer-facing, customer experience orientation that has been designed and inbuilt into the Business Barbados model. It will take some time. We're talking about change management, we're talking about a culture change, we're talking about a step change. It's a huge step, and it will take some time. And I ask for the public and for each of us to show a little grace when dealing with the members of that team, because even as we are frustrated, they too, and I've said this before, have been frustrated, but they are committed to delivering change and to finding solutions. And so the first board meeting officially was held on Monday, and they spent, I believe, 5 hours in that first board meeting, a lengthy board meeting, making some critical decisions on the first orders of priority for the company. And I've given them some marching orders as minister in terms of policy. And these are the following things. And I want to say this here because I've said it in another environment. The business of business facilitation and protecting brand Barbados and delivering on that brand promise is not the custodian of only the government of Barbados. It is for all of us to address, and it is not the custodian only of CAIPO. And so we have undertaken the following high-order, first-order priorities. 1, how difficult is it for us to navigate other government agencies as well? In this legislation, the exemption for customs that was not there made it extremely difficult, because then members who were otherwise eligible for foreign currency permits had to wait for the Ministry of Finance to grant the waiver. And while they were waiting for the Ministry of Finance to grant the waiver, the goods were sitting, waiting to be cleared, but they couldn't do anything with it without the finance waiver. We need to be able to break down, deconstruct, and reconstruct those processes to make them easier for people to do business. We've spoken also about engagements with other government agencies, the BRA, National Insurance Scheme, Customs Department. How do we break down, deconstruct, as Prime Minister always says to us, and reconstruct those processes? Now, we've done a deconstruct and reconstruct for CAIPO. We've done a business process re-engineering process for CAIPO. We now know what needs to be done vis-a-vis the legislation for CAIPO, but we now need to have an all-of-government approach to deconstructing and reconstructing, so it is much easier for people to do business with the state. But I put the state up first because we must lead by example. But I took the opportunity last year at the Institute of Chartered Accountants annual general meeting to say to them and to the business community gathered there, business facilitation is not only about business with the state either. It's not only about regulatory compliance. And I took the opportunity to say then, as I will say here, delivering on the brand promise of Barbados and ensuring that Barbados is a place where businesses choose to do business is also for accountants to ensure that we are able to get management accounts and audited financial statements and on an annual basis in a timely manner in order to be able to satisfy governance requirements. It is also important for us to be able to dissect what is going to be important for what type of transaction and how do we break down those processes and make them more easier to access for people. It is also about, Mr. President, how long it takes to complete legal transactions. It is also about how we get legal transactions completed in a way that allows for us to close transactions. It is also, Mr. President, about how long it takes for us to be able to close deals once conveyances and all those things have been completed. How long does it take to complete these things? That is a part of business facilitation, Mr. President. We talked a lot about the banking community. How long does it take to access a loan? How long does it take to open a bank account? The business of business facilitation and delivering on the brand promise that is Barbados as a place to do business is all of our business. It is a business, it is the business of the government of Barbados, it is the business of the private sector and the professional associations of Barbados, and it is the business of the service providers who are intermediaries along the way. The business of doing business is all our business. And so one of the first order priorities for the first quarter of this year for Business Barbados is the development of standard operating procedures and service level agreements with a number of main private sector partners, namely the accountants and bankers and all of them, to be able to figure out how do we break down antiquated processes, excuse me, make them easier, excuse me, how do we break down antiquated processes, make them easier for people to navigate while still complying with our compliance obligations. One of the things that I said in a meeting this week with another team was, it's easy for all of us to look at everybody else. So everybody knew the problems with KIPO because everybody experienced it. And we're clear, we own them. But let us look also at the ecosystem that surrounds doing business in this country. And that ecosystem is public and private sector, and it requires all of us to elevate our game. So that line in the sand that KIPO now has to draw on my instruction and covering it over with cement is also a line in the sand that needs to be drawn for many private sector entities, for many private sector transactions. And we are committed, this is not a blame game, we are committed to working with each of those partners to see how together, working towards the same goal, we can collaborate. The same way we did a business process re-engineering process for us, we will be collaborating to see how we can do a business process re-engineering process for all of government, and then equally for our partners in the private sector. I am happy that our partners have been on board and have been supportive and have been willing to work with us towards the same goal. And I have every confidence that once this work is completed in time to come, that it will be something that Barbadians can hold up as a thing of pride. But the implications thereof, Mr. President, will be, we expect by 2025, 2026, and what I've asked from the team is to set targets, revenue targets, number of businesses that we are going, number of companies that we will be going after in each various segment of the market on an annual basis. Where do we want to go? I just went through the numbers from 2018 when the regime began up to 2024. So am I going to be comfortable, Mr. President, with 2024 numbers? No, clearly not. Am I going to be comfortable with 2018 numbers? No. Even though we have seen a steady increase in the numbers, is that really the pace of increase that we require, or should it be an accelerated increase? That's really the kind of granularity that you're going to be seeing coming out of our team going forward. And I am confident that with these changes that are before this honorable chamber and the other FCP measures that go along with us as a competitive jurisdiction, that Barbados is positioning itself for a whole of government reform process, and then to position ourselves to deliver on a brand promise that Barbados is indeed a place not just to do business by marketing, but we deliver on that brand promise. And with those few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill is read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Walters.
Good morning, Mr. President. I'd like to contribute briefly to the foreign currency permit bill that is before the chamber. And I first would like to commend Senator Cummings for her thorough presentation as it relates to giving us in the chamber and giving Barbados the comfort that Barbados is still pursuing rigorously global business. It is very important to our existence. And as you know,